Hello and welcome to another video. In this one, I'll be covering some updates, territorial changes on the front line, and then I'll be doing an analysis of the situation around Bakhmut, and I'll have four options for the different scenarios that could happen from this situation right now. So starting out with the territorial changes, we can look at the recap options of this map. And here we see that the Russian forces have managed to advance to the south of Sheverne. They've managed to capture these trench networks to the north of Vodiane and south of Sheverne, as well as this patch of forest to the west of it. However, they have not managed to attack the trench network to the northeast of Vodiane or southeast of Sheverne. This is still under Ukrainian control. So essentially what we see here is that the Russian forces are advancing further northwards in the direction of Sheverne. How is this important? Because if we look at the northeastern part of Avdiivka, the Russian forces have also managed to capture this village here to the northeast of Avdiivka. So this village here is a small village, and that is indicated by the fact that there's no name here on Google Maps for it. However, the name of the village is Vesele, and essentially the Russian forces managed to capture this village. This capture was actually reported to be done by Russian forces, which combined armed tactics, essentially infantrymen with tanks and artillery, as well as airstrikes and drone technology, all working together to take control over the village. Then we move on to the Bakhmut front, where here the Russian forces have managed to capture further sections of the southern part of the residential area of Bakhmut. Here, after the recent capture of the canal between the east and western banks of the Bakhmutovka River, the Russian forces have since then advanced further northwestwards, which essentially gives them a better standing position within the south of the city. At the same time, they also managed to capture the rest of the residential area to the northwest of the city, which allows them to now have control over the river line between the reservoir here to the northwest of Bakhmut and the whole river line that the Ukrainian forces recently flooded when the Russian forces managed to capture this northern part a couple of days ago. So essentially now the Russian forces have the river line here to the northwest and the river line to the east. This leaves them with a lot of options to essentially make a large significant push to the northwest of the city as well as the south of the city. So this brings me to option number one. The first option is an operation where the Russian forces essentially push southwards towards Khomove and westwards towards the Jasevyar area. This will allow the Russian forces to cut off the final escape route for the Ukrainian forces, and then they push southwards in the direction of Ivanivske from the north. So this is all high ground compared to Ivanivske. So advancing from Khomove as well as this part here will allow them to have the high ground against Ivanivske, significantly reducing the effectiveness of the fortifications the Ukrainians have built in Ivanivske, as well as endangering the city, as it will allow the Russian forces to combine their attacks and envelop the city from both the north and the south. Such an operation would require for the ground to become solid, and that is very interesting because currently we are in the season in which it rains a lot. And when there's a lot of rain, the ground will stay muddy. For it to stay dry, it will require at least a week of sunshine with little to no rain. However, if such a scenario occurs and lack of rain allows the ground to become dry and solid, the Russian forces could launch an armored offensive around the northern part of Ivanivske, completely sealing off Bakhmut from both the eastern side of Ivanivske as well as the western side of Ivanivske, and essentially creating a wall around Bakhmut. So option one is essentially a scenario similar to that of Mariupol. So here we see that the Ukrainian forces stay to defend the city, and then the Russian forces launch this offensive, which essentially encircles the city with little notice. In this situation, the Ukrainian forces will be forced to protect this part here, which is the industrial area of the city. It is similar to the Azovstal steel plant, so essentially the Ukrainian forces could stay here and protect it for a long time. However, how long they are able to fight for depends on how much ammunition and how much supplies they do have. But at the very least, we can expect them to hold out for a couple of weeks if they manage to create proper defensive positions around this industrial area, and if the Russians refuse to enter it and instead just complete their encirclement. So that is option 1. Now we move on to option number 2. Option number 2 is a Russian armored offensive, which goes westwards rather than southwards. So with this, they will have to fight northwestwards and find the crossings across the canal, which will allow them to essentially move westwards of Jezhev Yar and attack it from the northern direction. This will allow them to essentially cut off all roads leading to Jezhev Yar from mainly Konstantinivka, but also from the northern section. If such an operation needs to succeed, the Russian forces will also need to attack Stupushki as well as Prishtina and take control over the highway between Jezhev Yar and Konstantinivka. If the Russian forces manage to capture both this highway as well as break through the northern part, the Russian forces will then be able to catch Jezhev Yar as well in their encirclement, which would leave Bakhmut and Ivanivsky within this encirclement, and the Ukrainian forces will be forced to create some sort of counteroffensive to break these areas through, because the estimated amount of troops in this section is between 20 and 30,000 troops. Such a huge loss will be a significant disadvantage to the Ukrainians, as the Russians will have little to no losses compared to that amount in such a scenario. While at the same time, a collapse of both Bakhmut and Jezhev Yar will significantly reduce the Ukrainian defensive capabilities around Siversk, as this whole northern area, road between Slovyansk and the Russian positions, will be forced to be used to try and break out the Ukrainian forces in Jezhev Yar and Bakhmut, which would leave the Russian forces an opening to reach Slovyansk from this eastern part and essentially take control over this highway. This will allow them to essentially encircle Siversk as well. There will, of course, be some pontoon bridges to the north of Siversk. However, in this scenario, the Russian forces are able to constantly harass the Ukrainian forces and essentially blow these bridges up with precision strikes, both with aircraft as well as missile strikes and long-range precision artillery. So that is it for option 2. Then we move on to option number 3. In this scenario, we talk about the Ukrainian successes. So Ukraine has an opportunity to essentially relieve the Ukrainian forces within the city of Bakhmut, and for that they will need to strike at Russia's weakest point, and that is to the north. The north is a recently captured part of this front line to the Wagnerians. This means that they are most likely less fortified than any other parts of the front line. And at the same time, we see that a large portion is cut into by the highway. If the Ukrainian forces manage to recapture this highway here to the north of Bakhmut, they'll be able to essentially cut the Russian forces in the north into two, and they can reach the river line between Bakhmutovka river line between Bakhmut and Soledar, essentially cutting all the Russian forces into two in the western bank of the Bakhmutovka river. This will allow the Ukrainian forces to then push from the northern area around the Siversk area, Vesikivka, and push southwards, which will completely cut off any crossings the Russian forces may have across the river line. So essentially cutting the Russian forces into three. What is east of the Bakhmutovka river and what is west of the Bakhmutovka river is cut into two. So there will be two pockets of Russian forces, and these will all be vulnerable as this is all open areas, and the few highlands there are comparable to what Ukraine already holds. So the Russians will neither have the high ground advantage nor the terrain advantage. They will be vulnerable and they will be cut off. However, for such an offensive to succeed, the Ukrainians must gather a large offensive force, and they have to bypass all of the Wagnerian defenses in this area. And that brings me to option number 4, which is a Ukrainian offensive elsewhere on the map to force the Russian forces to send troops elsewhere to properly defend. And by this I mean the Zaporizhia front. If we look at the Zaporizhia front, we can see that the whole front line is completely open. It's open fields. So a large gathering of Ukrainian forces, especially if they have modern equipment as well as well-trained soldiers, they'll be able to successfully conduct an offensive in this direction. However, the Russian forces have created a large number of fortifications in this area, so it will all depend on two things. The first one is exactly how long does Ukraine have to prepare for this offensive, because it seems that the last days of Bakhmut are numbered. There's only a few days left for this city before it falls, which is why it seems that Zelensky wants to hold the city at all costs, because they want to keep delaying so that they have more time to prepare for an offensive elsewhere on the map. And then the second thing is how many troops and trained soldiers as well as equipment does Russia actually have? There seems to be a lot of disinformation and misinformation around that subject, particularly as all Western media wants to spread the narrative that the Russian soldiers only have shovels to defend themselves and that they're completely outgunned, they have no equipment, they have no soldiers, they have nothing. While the Russian media is essentially saying that the Russian forces are extremely well trained and well prepared and have all the equipment that they need. So which is true? Probably neither. It's probably somewhere in the middle where the Russian forces are well equipped, well trained. However, they have some missing items. They aren't really that motivated to go on the offensive, knowing that it could cost their lives. Something around those lines. I'm not saying those things are specifically them, but I believe it is somewhere in the middle where the Russian forces are well equipped and well trained. However, how many of them there is actually available is up for debate, which is why these predictions are very difficult. There's a lot of misinformation and disinformation going around, which essentially makes it impossible to accurately determine what is true and what is not, as there's no clear evidence as to what either are. There's a lot of fallacies in all the evidence that both sides give. But essentially, in the scenario where the Russian forces are undertrained and under-equipped, the Ukrainian forces would be able to launch a successful offensive here to the south in the direction of Zaporizhia and Melitopol, cutting off the land bridge between Crimea and Russia. In case that the Russian forces are actually well equipped and well trained and well prepared, then the Ukrainian offensive will gain initial success before getting utterly demolished, and the Russian forces taking advantage of that scenario would launch their own offensive, essentially cutting through the Ukrainian lines. So what will happen essentially depends on those two things. How much time does Ukraine have to prepare, and what exactly is the truth around Russia's both manpower and firepower? And that is going to be all for this video. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed this type of format, then let me know and make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.